When the family and the church try to operate mutually exclusive of each other, there will be conflict, there will be tension, there will be separation and divisions. And I think that for me is the final takeaway. Human beings are social beings, and we have to find a way to take each other along.
Welcome to everybody. Welcome to yet another edition of Read with Daisry. Today we're going virtual. Of course, we launched off the very first edition in person at the NTN in February, where we had such a wonderful time really exploring the thoughts of Frantz Fanon in his Wretched of the Earth. However, today we will be exploring Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. And so basically, as I think most of you should know by now, the purpose of this reading platform, Read with Daisry, is really to get a culture of reading going amongst Namibian youth, and maybe not the so young ones as well. Everybody is, of course, welcome to join the group, and of course, to also try and get the literary arts into sort of the mainstream everyday life of the average Namibian. So this platform is convened by our very capable Ms. Daisry Mathias, the Presidential Advisor on Youth Matters and Enterprise Development. And today she will be taking us through Chimamanda's very interesting take on what it means to be and to be free and to do what you want to do in the context of freedom.
Thank you very much, Rakkel, and good morning to everyone who's joining us from near and far. As indicated, we're streaming live on Facebook, so there's a wider community who's following across the various platforms. Thank you for joining us to our second edition of the 2022 Reading Group Series, which continues our focus on modern African literature context as we examine and interrogate the forces that are shaping our present and those that are defining our tomorrow. You're all very welcome. As a recap, we kicked off the year for this reading year with the 1961 classic Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, which is the keystone book on colonialism and provided political justification for resistance and armed struggle, and influenced a lot of anti-colonial movements across the world, the continent, and Namibia as no exception. In May 2021, last year, we read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which explored the foundations of culture, African identity in the period that soon followed the rise to sovereignty of many African states and nationhood in post-colonial African states, especially during the 1960s. Today, we are exploring more deeply the themes of African culture and identity. We're traversing the tensions and the distinctions that do exist between traditions, religion, and spirituality in Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Purple Hibiscus. The story chronicles a different age, a different era in Nigeria 30 years after independence. And this book, Purple Hibiscus, is considered to be the sequel to Achebe's Things Fall Apart, completing the story of Nigeria pre and post-independence. A little bit about the author and the book. Today's author, Chimamanda Adichie, was born on 15 September 1977 in Enugu, Nigeria. She found Things Fall Apart by Achebe to be a transformative book, and after studying medicine in Nsukka, where she's originally from, in 1997, she left for the United States, where she studied communication and political sciences at the Eastern Connecticut State University. She split her time between Nigeria and the USA, and she received her master's in creative writing from the Johns Hopkins University, where she studied African history at Yale as well. Today's book, Purple Hibiscus, was published in 2003, and it is the first book by Chimamanda, and it really is a coming-of-age story. Other notable works by Chimamanda include Americana, The Love of Biafra, Half of a Yellow Sun, and more recently, Note on Grief, following the sad passing of both of her parents in a relatively short period of time. This book, Purple Hibiscus, captures the society of post-independent Nigeria in the era of democratic instability and the rule of military strongmen. It captures the period and the transition when the democratically elected civil government was usurped through a coup d'etat and at the time by the military dictatorship of Sani Abacha. during what President Geingob has narrated to be the second wave in his hypothesis of the three waves of African leadership, the first wave being that of the political liberators, the strongmen, and the third wave being the democratic dispensation of processes, systems, and institutions. So this story is set in Enugu, Nigeria, during a period of political instability and a degenerating federal government and an incompetent state that is riddled with corruption. Let's get now into the book review, unpacking the characters and the storyline. The book has a handful of characters, and the central character, the protagonist, is a 15-year-old adolescent girl who is named Kambili Achike. The story is told through the eyes and the words of Kambili, who lives with her father, Eugene, and her mother Beatrix, and her older brother Jaja, an affluent, well-to-do family. On the surface, they present as a perfect family of stature. They're well respected in both urban and rural communities. They practiced Orthodox Christianity and belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. Kambili's was a very rigid upbringing. She was disciplined, obedient, but a withdrawn child who seldom smiled, or she didn't even know how to laugh. However, she lacked a lot of personal convictions as she went about her day-to-day life and lived in a perpetual state of wanting to please her father, a state of guilt, a state of self-restraint and constraint, and a state of penitence, often beset with the fear of exposure by her father for any shortcoming that she may, as a young growing child, is so likely to do. Kambili and Jaja live at this crossroad of their father's religion, the family ties that bind, and the cultural norms and mores. The second character, which is the father Eugene Achike, was a very successful businessman. He owned a newspaper and a manufacturing plant of fast-moving consumer goods. He was strict. He was a very religious man, a devout Catholic. He was a husband to one, the father to the two children. He was a family man and a disciplinarian. Eugene is conservative, and he's quite an overbearing figurehead in the household. He wields a lot of moral authority over his family, particularly his daughter Kambili. Eugene is flawed, and he's human, and his vulnerabilities are revealed through his character. And he also espouses positive virtues, the virtues of bravery. He's a principled, incorruptible man and business leader, and he's the media editor who dangerously criticizes the corrosive military rule of Abacha at a time when it was not popular to do so. Consequently, the family and his employees, they face a lot of threats and terror from the ruling regime. Eugene did not want his own father, his biological father, to enter his home or to visit or have direct contact and interactions with his family, especially the children, because the father was a traditionalist, an Igbo man, or in the words of Eugene, a heathen, an unrepentant pagan, and an idol worshiper because of his cultural beliefs. Notably, Eugene spoke predominantly in English, and he frowned upon his indigenous Igbo language totally. He looked down on those who only spoke Igbo and preferred and embraced and respected more those who were conversant in English. His sister described him as a colonial product. The mother, the third figure, Beatrix, is a tolerant and long-suffering woman who's faced a lot of physical abuse in her home, in her marital home, at the hands of her husband, and has had multiple miscarriages as a result of her husband's physical abuse towards her. The next character of note is Eugene's sister, Efioma. Efioma is the aunt to Kambili and Jaja and the sister-in-law to Beatrix. She's a lecturer at the University of Nigeria and the widowed mother of 3 children. Although their relationship initially came under strain as a family because of the boundaries that were set by Eugene that restricted contact between his immediate family and extended family because of their differences in belief and faith, eventually the tensions subsided and the relationship was somewhat restored, and they were able to spend a Christmas together in Suka. At the family day, Efioma asked her brother to permit her to host the children at her house in Suka, to which Eugene reluctantly agrees, and he permits the travel to the sister's house for 1 week by Kambili and Jaja. The children, while in Suka at their auntie's house, they begin to flourish, and Kambili develops a confidence and a good relationship with not only her cousins, but particularly with a pastor who's a family friend by the name of Father Amadi. During this time, the aging father of Eugene and Efioma, the grandfather of Kambili, becomes very sick. And Efioma goes to the village to collect her father and brings him to her house in Suka for medical attention. However, Efioma does not inform the brother, neither does she seek the approval of Eugene, who has forbidden his children from associating with their unrepentant grandfather and sharing a house with him. The children, though, managed to establish a very good relationship with their grandfather during this time of his ailment, and not too long after he comes to Efioma's house, he dies in his sleep. Upon discovering the cover-up, Eugene punishes the children. He's very upset that they walked into sin, that they didn't disclose that they were sharing a house with their grandfather, a pagan. And because of that, he punishes them severely by pouring boiling water from the kettle onto their feet when he learned that they had even accepted a painting from their grandfather, through their cousin Amaka. He beat Kambili to the extent that she ended up in hospital in critical care, forcing her mother Beatrix, also who was being compelled by the sister-in-law, to face her demons, lest a greater evil befall her family. The physical abuse continued at home, and Beatrix miscarried again at the hands of her husband as a result of his violence. Broken and desperately seeking escape and also seeking vengeance for herself and her children, Beatrix poisons her husband's tea in the end, and he dies. To cover up for a crime that was committed by his mother, the son Jaja takes the place and takes the blame and also takes her place. He's incarcerated for killing his father and serves time in prison. He is later pardoned by the president on presidential pardoning and is able to be a free man, but he had lost a lot of hope and had become a broken man, disillusioned while in prison. There are a number of themes in this text, one of them exploring religious violence, where religion is used to exert violence under the guise of responsible parenthood. There's also gender-based violence and cycles of violence that are demonstrated through the text. And there is a certain level of hypocrisy in the Christian benevolence to strangers of Eugene, who in the village they call him Omulero, which means the big man who does good. But he denied his own next of kin. He placed restrictions, conditions on assisting his father or assisting his sister on the grounds that they first convert to his faith before he could extend any type of lifeline. They lived in a lot of lack, a lot of hardship, while he overflowed in abundance. And this placed a strain on their family relationship and the ties that he had with his immediate sister. It also begs the question of charity beginning at home and brings into focus the roles and the obligations of the African family to their immediate next of kin. But in Eugene's case, it was not an attempt really for him to try to escape black tax that we're all very familiar with. He was not trying to evade responsibility. Rather, he took a very uncompromising stance, although slightly judgmental, and almost used coercive tactics to try and persuade his family to convert to his faith and religion. Also, we can see the tensions between Orthodox and Pentecostal faith and religion coming across. Eugene shunned and he dismissed the mushrooming charismatic Pentecostal churches for their more spontaneous worship in song during ministration. He revealed his rigidity and his intolerance of the denominational faith and expression. There was a lot of dogma in the lifestyle, a lot of rituals, a lot of sanctimonious Christian practices, but with a clear absence of spirituality, of personal conviction, of faith, and of love. Towards the end, we also had to focus on corruption and the justice system in Nigeria at the time. There are a number of lessons that we can take out of this story. The first being that yes, the story has a deeper meaning. It is the story of a family that eventually becomes the story of a country. But we must, in the words of Chimamanda herself, in one of her TED Talks, guard against the danger of a single story, and that this cannot be an absolute metaphor of Nigeria yesteryear or today. The difference is also quite distinct between perfection and excellence. The father Eugene, in his pursuit of all righteousness, became self-righteous. His uncompromising pursuit of holiness and purity, his uncompromising pursuit to meet a standard pressured him and his family to almost reach an impossible standard. They just could not walk in that perfect path that he wanted them to walk all the time. These shortcomings then manifested into anger, into rage, into intolerance, into injustice. And then automatically and almost immediately, they would be followed by feelings of guilt, of regret, of shame, of penitence, and self-doubt. And this made him, Eugene, but also his wife and the victims, his children, rather inconsistent and unstable, shaky characters. And this draws me to reflect on just the relationship between excellence and perfection, because we are called rather not to pursue perfection, but to pursue excellence of character. But Eugene sought perfection, which is an impossible standard to begin with, because man is fallible and we are inherently flawed. And it is only grace that enables you to walk a righteous path. The second lesson is about silence and complicity. And I think this is central to Beatrix's character. Kambili's trauma and insecurities are hidden under her shyness and this stutter. I'm not sure how true, whether she really stuttered or whether she used her stuttering as a cover up to be able to avoid difficult situations and conversations. The mother Beatrix was suffering. She was dying in silence. She was not even free to disclose her situation to her sister-in-law, just how much abuse she really endured at the hands of her husband. And part of this reason is because we have created a culture, I believe, in society that is even relevant today, where it is not always a safe space for women who face abuse at home to come forward and to disclose their situations, even to the police or to next of kin. Also, there was this impression of a model family, a Christian family who practiced the values of tolerance and faith and long suffering, and divorce clearly was not an option to Beatrix, and she was prepared to continue suffering in silence. There may also have been economic reasons for her silence and a certain level of vulnerability. And we pick this up because she blamed herself for the miscarriages that she suffered actually as a result of the direct violence that was inflicted on her by her husband. And the everyday threat that her husband could at any point take a second wife to give her those children that she was unable to give to him. And also as Omuleru, he had a position as a village headman, a leader. He was in good economic standing, and it's not clear whether she would have been able to walk away from that lifestyle of comfort and security. Finally, I think it implores all of us to take a national, dialogue, to pick up a mirror and reflect and expose out the fault lines in our communities, in our households, at society at large. It's all right to talk about the victims, but what about the perpetrators? I found that we can even draw lessons on the cycles of poverty, not cycles of poverty, the cycles of abuse through the character of Eugene. And, he was the product of a certain environment that created that type of men. And I think it's important for us to look at the experiences creating a conducive environment where men do not grow to become perpetrators of violence against their own wives and children. But finally, what I must highlight as one of the lessons in the characters of Eugene was his consistency in enforcing his personal boundaries. Despite the disconcerting character and sometimes disagreeable value system, you may say, Eugene is consistent in one thing. He enforces his standard. When an elderly man who is also unrepentant and also labeled a pagan by Eugene, tries to enter his house during Christmas. He drew the same line that he had done for his own biological father, and he sent the man away. And he maintained that he will not associate with the ungodly, keeping the same energy. Eugene held himself and the family to an unsustainably high personal standard. And in the end, we see that both him and his wife and the children, they pay a terrible price for that psychological, emotional, physical trauma and abuse that was inflicted knowingly by him onto his family. Let's look at the women and profile the roles of the three women. Beatrix, I would describe to be resilient, but rather passive in character. She endured more than 17 years of abuse in that marriage. And in the end, she reached her breaking point. She cracked and she was pushed to the very extreme of killing her husband. She's defined more throughout the text for what she did not do rather than what she did, until the very end when she snapped and she did the unthinkable. I would have rather preferred her to be much more outspoken, to protect her daughter, to protect her children. But I understand that this was it was difficult because the husband was very overbearing and he limited her ability to speak up. And we could not really hear her voice in all of this that unfolded. More often than not, she was managing a situation rather than avoiding conflict and avoiding the risks that was ever present in their household. 15-year-old Kambili went through a very difficult process of maturation and personal awakening. She cared deeply for her father and she went to all ends to please him. She is the teller of the story, and this is a young girl who lives in a permanent tension between good and bad and facing and fighting her biggest demons. She lived in a perpetual state of fear, a perpetual state of wanting to please her father, and she was the complete opposite of her aunt, the aunt Efioma being the last and final female character. Efioma is an educated woman. She's a lecturer. She's independently minded, and she's portrayed to be more loving and more tolerant, although also faithful and religious. Efioma was fearless, but because of her assertive nature and her outspoken character, she finds herself denied an opportunity and is later dismissed from her job. But because of her education, she's able to make an escape from Nigeria, from poverty to America. There's some imagery that we're seeing in the text about Nigeria at the time. One of them being the imagery of an incompetent state with fuel shortages, power cuts, and insecure delivery of public services, such as health services, systemic corruption where police officers are singled out to extort bribes from motorists. Stark contrast of poverty and inequalities, the imagery of wealth and opulence, influence, abundance, the soft life of the Adichies highlighted through emphasis on the marble and handcrafted wooden flooring. Also, the 4-story village home, they had bogan villas, they had fruit gardens, and they had a fleet of family vehicles, including Eugene's Mercedes-Benz, which I found pretty ironic in sharp contrast to the mud and the thatch dwelling of his biological father in Suka, and the small, tiny, congested, packed apartment of Efioma, and the meager meal portions that they survived on as part of the working poor and the working class. So in conclusion, I think we can agree that, the central character, if the father Eugene was both the victim and the aggressor, and colonialism in Nigeria was very controversial. There were some similarities to the Namibian apartheid system as well. The British were not, they were not enough in number, in manpower to overpower and to conquer such a large country and nation like Nigeria. So colonization in Nigeria was operated using the locals themselves, very similar to how apartheid South Africa also applied divide and conquer tactics to Namibians. In Southwest Africa at the time, their colony, the Brits divided the Muslim North against the Christian South. And it was these tensions that were boiling over in this part of Nigeria when and where at the time that this book was being written. Nigeria has been ruled by military men, many of them coming from the North, strong military dictatorships, of which Sani Abacha was one, and he was a very fierce dictator. I mentioned earlier that this book is considered to be the sequel of Things Fall Apart. And I believe that it was greatly inspired by Chinua Achebe's life himself, because in his formative years, Achebe grew up also at this intersection of two role models that raised him: his biological father, who had converted to Christianity, and his grand uncle, the man that raised his father, who was an unrepentant pagan. Achebe was exposed to, both the Bible and to the mores and the culture of the southeastern Igbo people, from where he descended, while Chimamanda herself actually originated from Enugu and from Suka, where she lived. So I find that there was a good blend between her formative years, informed by her own childhood experiences and memories. And you can see this through her writing. Chimamanda is a fine writer. She demonstrates understanding of the details of life in Nigeria and what it was like to be there at that time. And overall, I find the book to be tense, rather melancholic through the eyes of this 15-year-old timid girl. But it was a smooth read in terms of her writing style. I found it very hard to put it down, and I completed the reading in 1.5 days. From a personal point of view, it was very relatable. And it became quite personal to me, and sometimes even challenging me, as I am also coming from a similar background of a very strong, Orthodox, conservative Christian upbringing. I grew up in my grandfather's house, and he was the bishop of the Evangelical Church of Namibia. And later attending in my primary schooling years a Roman Catholic convent, where I was introduced to the Catholic rituals of repentance and confession and living that life of penitence. And then in my older years, coming of age, and evolving into now Pentecostal faith, where the pursuit is for truth and for enlightenment and for intimacy relationship with God and the Lord Jesus Christ. So yes, there was a few relatable passages, but also some personal conflicts, I must admit, that were coming to the fore as I looked at these experiences through the eyes of this family, but also superimposing that to what we are experiencing as societies in post-independent Africa today. And that brings me to the end of my conclusion, Rakkel. We can now go into an interactive conversation as I wrap up this review.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for that review, Daisry. As always, there's so much to unpack. Chimamanda is an excellent writer, and she really takes you through. Although it's a fictional piece of work, like you said, it's so relatable. And even myself, as I was reading it, there were just so many aha moments that were going through my mind. Daisry, I wanted to have to ask you a few questions actually around some of the themes, because Chimamanda titles her book. She titles her book Purple Hibiscus. And sort of in her first chapter, she explains it as a freedom to be and to do. So can we just unpack that for a little while? Having shared the review the way you did, how would you then sum up her interpretation of this symbolic flower?
I didn't know that there was a purple hibiscus. We're all very familiar with the traditional red hibiscus. And at the beginning of the text, she describes, their lush garden. They've got cashew trees, they've got lots of flowers, they've got bougainvillea. And then she talks about, the intrigue of all their guests in the hibiscus plants that they have at their house. The purple hibiscus is an uncommon flower. The more commonly known one is the red one. But the differences between the red hibiscus and the purple hibiscus even have to do with the way that it flourishes, the extent to which it blossoms. The purple hibiscus is more special and flourishes at with less flowers than the red hibiscus. Now, this flower is mentioned about 5 times across the text. We see it at their family home in Enugu. Then when they go visit their aunt Efioma in Suka, we see that she also has a garden with purple hibiscus, and Jaja falls in love with this purple hibiscus. And when they return back to their family home, he brings back some stalks and plants this plants this plant into their family garden. And when he's in prison during a visitation, his sister and mother, encouraging hope into him, they tell him that the flowers have grown and they are flourishing and they are blossoming back at home. I think the symbolism is in the uniqueness, in the scarcity, the uncommon nature of the flower, the beauty of the flower. But I think it also speaks of the evolution of these children who really flourished and were able to open up and were able to come into a personal awakening during this unfolding time in their period, which she likens to the blossoming of a flower, particularly this beautiful purple flower.
That's good. All right. So she has a very interesting way of putting her books together. She doesn't have, the typical chapter 1, chapter 2. She has like 3 specific themes and they tell the whole story. So the first theme, of course, is breaking from God, which is very telling because, like you said, it's very similar to Things Fall Apart. She really started off with Things Fall Apart in that breaking from God, and it's sort of where the glass shattered at the very beginning. But under that, I wanted us to explore the danger of a single story, more so under the character of Mama Beatrix, because Beatrix, like you rightly said, is a victim of abuse, and she sort of demonstrated coping mechanisms to get buried deeper into that shyness and silence that you spoke about. So now when we have to bring it to the Namibian context where we're in a society so rife with SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence, what would breaking from the gods look like for the Namibian woman who is buried deep within the shyness and silence of abuse?
It's a very important observation that you make about Beatrix, because you see, the beauty with interpretation is we all see things from our vantage point. And the story comes full circle. She begins at the breaking point where the family hits the point of no return, where the son Jaja is starting to show symptoms of rebelling against the authority of the father, against the faith of the father. The father's violence is exposed to us in the very first pages of the book, and he hurls his missile at the son and he shatters the wife's figurines. But it also brings us to an important observation that you made, which is the symbolism of those figurines. We later learn in the text that those figurines, I think they were ballerina wooden carvings. They were very important for her because they gave her a passage, a space of escape where she would comfort herself by constantly polishing, cleaning, and pruning these items. It was kind of a route of escape for her. Some type of coping mechanism, I guess, as you indicated, from her reality. And in our context today, we see those coping mechanisms manifesting in different ways. I use the language to say that she's resilient and she's long-suffering and quite tolerant. Others in similar situations, they choose alcohol, they choose depression, they choose suicide, they choose other manifestations of violence because they are dealing with so much from within. So I think the symbolism of breaking from the gods was, it was the unraveling of the fabric of the family. It was the point that they started to disintegrate and started to actually, the chasm in the differences of their value system started to become visible. It was also indicative that, it was not sustainable, the track that they were on, and that eventually things would fall apart. But it came full circle and we saw exactly how it ended right from the way it started.
And it's she says gods plural, hey, so it's multiple gods. It's breaking from the father's abuse, breaking from their own shyness and silence that's been holding them back, breaking from the stutter for Kambili, for example, and for Jaja just being a defiant character and deciding, I'm going to cling to this flower, the purple hibiscus plant, and it's going to be a symbol of hope for me. This is how I'm breaking from the gods. It's fascinating how Chimamanda sort of leaves it to the reader's interpretation to define what breaking from the gods looks like for them. And for the Namibian context, it could be deciding to report that abusive boyfriend, or deciding to leave an abusive relationship, or deciding to change yourself. I mean, everybody has an idea of what their own gods are. And it's fascinating how Chimamanda leaves it to the reader to make that conclusion. All right, taking it further to another theme again, the second theme of her book, which is titled "Speaking with Our Spirits." Under this particular theme, for example, comes the conversation around: is religion and spirituality necessarily the same thing? Is it a yin-yang situation? Because when we talk about what is happening in the book, this family is being strangled by religion. But then a more charismatic believer would tell you, but that's not the faith that I ascribe to. Mine is more spirituality. And with that, I want us to bring in how the conversation around how can we take our families along on our spiritual journeys. So maybe ideally let's interrogate the character of Amadi, because I think Amadi represented that divide very well.
Great question. So, that's also where, as I was reading the story, I was slightly challenged. There was a lot of sanctimonious, a lot of rituals, a lot of religious dogma, very orthodox, that we go to mass, you fast the first hour before service, and the catechism and the Apostles' Creed, and it was all very structured. But if you look at the personalities of the children of the Father, there was a real absence of intimacy with God or the Holy Spirit. There was no love in that family, although it appeared that they were really, in terms of the perfect family, by relating to one another, there was an absence of love. And I'm talking about the love that could cast Kambili out of her perpetual state of fear. She lived in constant fear of judgment. She lived in constant fear of condemnation, instead of actually being so convicted because of the love that she receives from the father figure, biologically or spiritually, that she was loved unconditionally. So there definitely was this absence. And I think Amadi, the family friend and pastor of the auntie Efioma, Father Amadi, he's the one who introduces that by asking the fundamental question of, do you love Jesus? Do you love the Lord? And that's the distinction between religion and spirituality. The personal relationship, the fellowship, the communion, the pursuit of deeper intimacy with a divine entity, compared to religion, which is the state of the church, the rules, what to do, what not to do, the brick and the mortar. And we find that, in this context, they were very denominational. They were very fixed on the church and the dogma that is often associated with the church, but losing sight of the immortality of Christ and the deeper meaning. And I think this is where we have these contentions in society, in terms of the role of the church. Pre-independence, the church played a very big political role in pre-independent Namibia, and liberty and, advocacy and pressure, and also just being the social conscience of our communities. But post-independence is becoming a little bit difficult in terms of the centrality of the church. It has become very individualistic sometimes. The individual now is pursuing faith, but at the risk of leaving the family behind. And the family and the church are two very important institutions in our socialization, in our culturalization, in our moral and ethical orientation. And the challenge is, for me, in this book, the contrasts are made very clear that when the family and the church try to operate mutually exclusive of each other, there will be conflict, there will be tension, there will be separation and divisions. And I think that, for me, is the final takeaway. Human beings are social beings, and we have to find a way to take each other along. It cannot be mutually exclusive. And if it is mutually exclusive, the lesson we can take from Eugene is that it's not sustainable. You will reach a breaking point. These are the two most important institutions in our social fabric, and we must find a way to take each other along.
It's fascinating because you just actually spoke into her last and final theme, which is pieces of gods. Like, okay, now that you've broken the gods and you've spoken with your spirit, and you need to pick a god, you need to pick a piece of a god that you go with. And I think in you saying that you need to take the family along on your faith journey is really, I think, the centrality, the key message that should really resonate from today's session, that if you want to bridge the gap that we see in society today, where families are torn apart in the name of the church, you need to find a way as a family to take each other along and be uncomfortable in some of those conversations for the sake of keeping the family unit intact.
I just want to congratulate you for bringing up this informative information. For me, it was the first time I heard about the book, and I learned so much from this book. Keep up that good spirit. I want to appreciate the point that my daughter Mathias and Andreas brought up for us to learn from the past. There is one book written by Paul Creer in 1870 something, saying, leer uit die verlede, alles wat goed en edel is, en bouw daarop je toekomst. Learn from the past to build your future. What I'm saying now, from the book you brought up, we are learning a lot of things, and it will help us for our future in terms of a cultural upbringing, education, values, corruption, parenting, church, and so on. And I also want to be understood that Nigeria, we are speaking about Nigeria, was Nigeria that helped us as a country to be liberated. Nigeria gives us $1 million every year to help the struggle by SWAPO to free the country. So despite their challenges, they help us. It's why also they became frontline state and SADC and frontline state during the struggle. The point I'm making is that we need to learn from this, especially in bringing up our young people. In addition to this book, there's one book I want us to read as this one. This book, it will fit this one. The name is Love for Imperfect Things by Sunin. So I want us to, in line with the book of Chimamanda, also to be read in line with this book, so that it will help us to bring up our children in line with the new thinking, learn from the past, to give our good future. So in conclusion, it was a good discussion. Keep up the good work.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Really appreciate your thoughts on that. And of course, as one of our fathers, it's always good to hear that the conversation around, especially taking the family along when it comes to your religious faith, is very important. It's something that you deem as very important for young people, especially to do.
Thank you very much, Rakkel, and thank you, Tate Kayamo, for those words. Really, the reason why we're doing this is so that we can continue learning and enlightening each other. I find that the more enlightened we are as individuals, the more enlightened the society, the easier for our society to progress. And we are deliberate about reading African stories, African literature, because we want to know and understand our own history and to tell our own stories. And we are committed. We're going to continue reading a book a month. Now, today we concluded West Africa, we did Nigeria. And as we move to next month's choice, next month is Independence Day, but there has been an unexpected event in modern history that we saw taking place on the 23rd of February this year. It was the 23rd or 24th, with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. I believe that this is a defining moment in our moment history. I find that the future that we had envisioned is going to be significantly affected by this turn of events. So I want to give you the opportunity, because we must be, fixed in principle, but flexible in the approach. We have two books in front of us that I am putting on the table for us to read next month. And by a show of hands of the people who are here, maybe we can agree together which book we want to read. There's from East Africa, I thought maybe this would be a good time for us to read Barack Obama, The Promised Land, which is the memoir of his presidency, but also really a reflection on geopolitical, the future of democracy, not only his past as president, but it takes a forward-looking look at the future of the world. There's also another interesting book that was written by his national security advisor, Ben Rhodes. The name of that book is After the Fall, Being American in the World That We Have Made. And this is a reflection on the most recent presidency of the United States, but also takes a look at the relationship of America with Europe and all the nations of the world. And although Ben is now not African, we're starting to elevate into the international politics, and just to see how Africa fits into the unfolding events. How are we going to be affected by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? So what do you guys think? Drop it in the chat. Should we read Obama's memoir, The Promised Land, or should we read Ben's book, After the Fall? Two say Promised Land, one says After the Fall. And that's 4 on Promised Land. So there we have it unanimously. Our next book for the month of March is going to be the memoir of President Barack Obama, The Promised Land. And I think we'll use that opportunity to really reflect on global current affairs, international politics, the relationship between the West, Europe, and the East, and how Africa and our generation fit into all of this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Daisry. And I want to thank each and every one of the participants, the ones that we can see on Zoom and the ones that are tuning in live on different social media platforms. Like Daisry said, we're delving into the thoughts of President Barack Obama for the month of March. So please do join us. And from me, once again, appreciate hanging out with you guys on this lovely Saturday. And I'll see you on the last Saturday of March as well. Cheers. Have a good afternoon.